What if some of the greatest minds we celebrate in Western history didn't actually invent their groundbreaking ideas?
You mean like they just popularized them?
Exactly. Deep dive into just that kind of claim. We're focusing specifically on the intellectual legacy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, but looking at it through a very challenging lens.
Yeah, our source for this is an article called Leibniz, Unmasking the Theft of Knowledge. It's written by the assistant to Dr. Maҳмуджон Қўчқоровнинг.
Okay, and he's an expert in linguistics, AI, and this theory about the origins of human knowledge. Odom-Tilly theory, is that right?
That's the one, Odom-Tilly theory.
So our mission today is to explore this article's, frankly, incredibly provocative claim.
Right.
The idea that the intellectual foundations we attribute to people like Leibniz, Newton, even Descartes, maybe they aren't rooted in just individual genius.
But in what? Appropriation. Rebranding.
That's what the article argues, yeah. Appropriation and rebranding of existing knowledge. We're going to examine whether modern intellectual history contains what this source actually calls a silent crime, a systematic repackaging of scientific legacy.
Okay, wow. That's a heavy claim.
It is. Okay, let's really lean into this. We've all been taught, this standard story. Western Enlightenment starts with the Greek miracle.
Right, that's the baseline, usually.
It's so ingrained, that idea, but this article just throws a wrench in that, doesn't it? So, if not Greece, where does it suggest the real cradle of knowledge actually was?
Well, this article argues the evidence points somewhere else entirely. It posits that the real cradle of knowledge was the Turkic Islamic world.
Okay.
Specifically, it highlights cities like Cordoba, Granada, and Seville.
In Spain, Al-Andalus.
Exactly. Between the 9th and 15th centuries under Turkic Islamic dynasties, these places were truly global hubs. Science, math, astronomy, law, medicine, philosophy. It was all happening there.
And what kind of knowledge are we talking about? I mean, the text gets pretty specific about what was in those libraries.
Oh, absolutely. The article describes really advanced works. Algebra, calculus, spherical trigonometry, the math you need for astronomy and navigation.
By figures like Al-Khwarizmi?
Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Tusi, Ulugh, yeah. And it mentions huge medical encyclopedias from Ibn Sina, Avicenna, plus really deep treatises on logic and metaphysics from Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali. And get this, it also talks about symbolic systems and a kind of decimal binary hybrid counting.
Based on what?
Based on human anatomy and phonetic cognition, how sounds relate to meaning. This is what the source connects to Odom-Tilly.
That's a staggering amount of sophisticated knowledge. So, okay, what happened then when Europe encounters this tradition?
Well, the article claims that in 1492, with the Christian conquest of Al-Andalus, Europe basically inherited this massive archive of knowledge.
Inherited it? Okay.
But according to this perspective, what followed wasn't a proper acknowledgement, it was systematic erasure of where it came from.
Systematic erasure. So if this knowledge was inherited, how does the source say it got, laundered into Western science? What's this European rebranding machine it talks about?
It outlines a pretty clear 5-step pattern, according to the article.
Okay, what are the steps?
First, glorifying Greek civilization, making it seem like the only valid intellectual ancestor.
Right, setting the stage.
Second, translating these Islamic Turkic manuscripts mostly into Latin, but crucially without giving credit. No attribution.
Ah, okay. Stripping the names.
Third, reassigning the authorship, giving the credit to emerging European figures Galileo, Pascal, Leibniz, Newton, the big names we know.
Got it.
Fourth, deliberately painting Islamic science as medieval, maybe faith-bound, basically implying it wasn't relevant to modern progress.
Dismissing it.
And fifth, promoting this myth of individual genius. Mm-hmm. The story of heroic, lone white men discovering everything from scratch.
Wow. That's a methodical process the article lays out. It sounds very deliberate, not accidental.
That's the argument, yes. Very deliberate.
And it's this exact process, the article argues, that makes Leibniz one of the main beneficiaries of this whole laundering operation, as they call it.
Precisely. And the article tries to back this up with specific examples. It compares Leibniz's famous contributions to what it says already existed in the East.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, calculus. Differential and integral. The source claims it was essentially already developed in the works of people like Al-Tusi, Bujani, Ulugh, It mentions derivative concepts being used in their astronomical tables, models for planetary motion.
So the core ideas were already there, potentially.
That's the assertion.
Yeah.
And then there's the binary system. Leibniz is famous for popularizing it in Europe, right?
Yeah, foundational for computing.
But the article argues that binary logic, based on like fingers and symbolic language, had been around for ages in Turkic phonosemantic systems.
Phonosemantic, meaning sound and meaning linked.
Yeah, like where the sounds of language themselves carry inherent meaning, often tied to the body or nature, and also in things like prayer beads, tasbih, used for structured mental counting. Binary thinking wasn't new, is the point.
Wow, okay. So calculus, binary, these core concepts presented as pre-existing. That really does reframe that lone genius's narrative, doesn't it? What about his philosophy?
Yeah, it goes into that too. Leibniz's monadology, his theory about reality being made of these indivisible mind-like units called monads, often seen as a major metaphysical innovation.
Right.
But this source points out that Islamic scholars like Fakhr al-Din al-Razi and Avicenna had already written a lot about atomistic structures of reality, about indivisible metaphysical units. Similar concept.
And law. The article mentioned law, too.
It did. It suggests that Western thinkers working on legal and political reform borrowed heavily from things that came before. Pre-Islamic Turkic codes, Sasanian administrative law from Persia, and Sharia jurisprudence, all of which, it argues, clearly preceded Enlightenment ideas about rights and sovereignty.
Okay, so if you pull all those examples together, calculus, binary, monads, legal theory, the article's conclusion about Leibniz is pretty stark, isn't it?
It's blunt. It says he was not a creator, he was a highly skilled rebrander of knowledge that had already reached maturity elsewhere.
That's striking. It forces you to look past just who published what first and question the whole process of how we build these intellectual legacies. It's less about individual IQ and more about who controls the story, maybe.
And that connects to something else the article brings up, what it calls the silent admission.
Silent admission, what's that?
It points out how Western history often talks about, say, the absence of female thinkers or a gap in progress during the so-called Dark Ages.
Right, you hear that narrative.
But the article asks, why don't we usually address how and why non-European voices were specifically silenced or written out of that same history?
So it's not just an absence, it's an exclusion. And the article connects Leibniz directly to this.
Yes, it emphasizes that Leibniz had access. He apparently had access to translated manuscripts coming out of Al-Andalus.
So he could have known the origins.
The claim is yes, and that these texts were decontextualized, stripped of names, and fed into European universities as raw material for Renaissance thought. The article states flatly, the exclusion was not accidental, it was strategic.
Strategic exclusion, okay. So zooming out, what's the article's main overarching conclusion about this whole period?
Well, the big takeaway, according to this source, is that the whole myth of Europe kind of inventing science in the 17th century, that needs a serious rethink.
Yeah.
Because, the article argues, Europe actually rebranded Eastern knowledge under Western names. It actively suppressed the epistemological roots, the knowledge foundations of Islamic Turkic civilizations.
And built its own narrative on top of that.
Exactly. Created a civilizational narrative of superiority based on appropriation. It's incredibly direct. It says, quote, the genius of Leibniz is no longer a question of IQ. It is a question of intellectual property theft.
Wow. IP theft. That's about as strong a charge as you can make in intellectual history.
It is. And given this really strong reframing, the article doesn't just critique. It also introduces an alternative framework.
Right. You mentioned Dr. Qўčqorov's Odom-Tilley theory, the human language theory.
Mm-hmm.
How does that propose to sort of recenter science? What's the idea there?
Well, according to the article, this theory tries to ground science differently. First, on empirical cognition rooted in the human body itself. Like, our basic understanding comes from physical interaction.
Okay, more embodied knowledge.
Sort of. And second, on a symbolic phonetic understanding of language, how sounds and symbols connect to our experience of nature. Third, it calls for a kind of civilizational ethics that puts knowledge back into its original context, acknowledges the source.
So bringing the history and the ethics back into science.
That seems to be the idea. The article wraps up by suggesting science needs to return to its natural foundation, the human, the truthful, and the universal.
The human, the truthful, the universal. This raises a really important question for you, the listener, doesn't it? If we start to rethink the very foundations of what we consider modern science, like this article pushes us to do, what other assumptions might we need to reconsider about how knowledge is created, how it's shared, and, crucially, how it gets attributed.
Yeah.
It certainly makes you reflect on how important it is to acknowledge